The morning the bank's letter arrived at her sister's gate, Folake was 3 towns away, standing in a hall that smelled of fresh paint, watching her husband's name get engraved onto a plaque he hadn't asked for. She did not yet know about the letter. She only knew that 14 years had passed since a rainy Tuesday when her father, thin and running out of time, had asked his 2 daughters a question neither of them had been prepared to answer honestly. She had answered it anyway. Her sister had answered it too, in her own way, with a delay of 11 days and a decision that would take a decade to finish costing what it cost. Neither of them understood on that rainy Tuesday that their father wasn't really choosing husbands. He was handing each of them a mirror and asking which reflection they were willing to live inside for the rest of their lives. One daughter looked and told the truth about what she saw. The other daughter looked away and spent the next 14 years trying to outrun what she'd refused to see. Before you go any further, if you've ever been the one in your family who quietly absorbed a cost so someone else's life could stay comfortable, type "carried" in the comments. And if you know someone who needs to hear that the quiet choice is really the losing one, send them this before you finish watching. Now, let's go back to where it started. Bayo Fashola was not a rich man, but arithmetic had been kind to him in a way money never was. For 36 years, he taught bookkeeping and commerce at a technical college in a mid-sized eastern town, training clerks and shopkeepers in the discipline of making sure every column balanced before you trusted what it told you. He liked to say a life, like a ledger, would eventually reveal the truth of itself. You simply had to be patient and honest enough to let the entries finish adding up. He married Funke, a woman whose laughter could be heard 3 houses down. Together, they raised 2 daughters in a house with a leaking roof they never got around to fixing. Folake was the elder by 5 years, her father's daughter in the sense that mattered, watching a room before speaking in it, sitting inside a problem until it explained itself. She taught accounting at the same technical college where her father had spent her career, in the very building, sometimes the very classroom where she'd once copied his handwriting off the board. She was 34, unmarried, and had long made peace with a family arithmetic, in a household where one daughter's wants arrived like weather, sudden, loud, and impossible to ignore. The other learned to keep her own wants folded small enough that nobody tripped over them. Her sister, Ada to everyone who loved her, was the kind of beauty that rearranges a room's attention without asking permission. She'd grown up watching doors open before she'd finished knocking, and had come to believe that was simply how doors behaved. She wasn't cruel. She was untested. Nobody had ever required her to sit inside a disappointment long enough to learn what it could teach, and so she'd reached 30 with a great deal of charm and very little practice at wanting something she couldn't immediately have. Folake did not resent her sister for it, not really. She had simply learned, the way you learn a language by living inside it, that love in their house often meant standing slightly to the side so someone else could stand in the light. The illness had taken Bayo, the way water takes a riverbank, not all at once, but steadily, until one day the shape of him was simply different. He called for his 2 daughters on a Tuesday evening while rain hammered the tin roof he never fixed. He asked Funke to bring the girls and then to wait outside, which told Folake before a word was said that whatever was coming had been sitting in him a long time. "There are 2 men," he said without preamble, "whose fathers I have spoken with. I want to settle this before I go." He never said die, he said go, the way you describe leaving a room you intended to return to, even though everyone understood he wouldn't. "Folake, there is a young man named Segun Adewale. His father and I were in the teachers' union for 20 years. The son has done well, a transport and haulage business, growing fast." "Is he a decent man or simply a successful one?" Folake asked. "Those aren't always the same question." Her father's mouth curved, the closest thing to a smile his illness allowed. "Exactly the right question. From what I know, decent." "Then I will meet him, and if what you say is true, I will honor your request." He turned to Adaize near the window, arms folded. "Ada, there is another young man, Tunde Bakari. He repairs generators and small engines. A workshop, nothing more, though he's building it carefully. His father was the most honest mechanic I ever hired. Adaize's expression shifted the way weather shifts. A generator repairman? A hard-working one, her father said evenly, from people who understand what a cost costs. He looked between them. Will you honor this? Yes, Papa, Folake said, without hesitation. Adaize took longer. When it came, her yes arrived thin, like something said mostly to end the conversation. He closed his eyes. Then I can rest, he said. And 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning with church bells drifting through the window, he did. Adaize waited 9 days after the burial. On the 10th, she found Folake and her sister sorting through her father's papers at the dining table. The same table, still uneven on one leg, and sat down across from them with the particular calm of someone who has already made a decision and is only now getting around to announcing it. She said, I've been thinking. I'm not going to marry Tunde. The room did the thing rooms do after a sudden noise. One beat of total silence followed by everyone deciding what to do with what they just heard. Ada, her mother said carefully, your father is gone, Adaize said, not unkindly, which somehow landed harder than cruelty would have. And I'm the one who has to spend the rest of my life inside whatever we decide today. Folake set down the papers and asked her sister, what exactly are you deciding? Adaize met her eyes directly for the first time since sitting down. I went to see Segun's haulage yard last week. 3 warehouses, Folake. New trucks in a straight row like teeth in a good smile. She chose her next words carefully, like arranging furniture. I want him, not the generator man. Him. The silence that followed was a different animal, the kind that arrives once something has been said that can no longer be unsaid. Folake studied her sister, walking through it with the part of herself that loved Adaize rather than the part that could have easily been angry with her, which was slower but truer. That man was chosen for me, she said, finally, evenly. I know, Adaize said. I'm asking you to let it go to me instead. You can still marry. Tunde is a good man. Papa said so himself. Folake understood with the clarity grief sometimes hands you free of charge exactly what was happening. Adaize had seen 3 warehouses and mistaken the scenery for the person standing in front of it. And no explanation would fix that because nobody had ever required her to learn the difference. She understood too that her mother was about to do what she always did when the sisters disagreed, turn to the elder one and ask her to absorb the difference. Folake, her mother said with a voice thin as thread, please. The word landed the way her mother's request always landed, not as an order, but as something breakable set gently into her hands. The family's peace passed into her keeping because she had always been the one trusted to carry breakable things without dropping them. She sat with it. Then she said, all right. Relief moved across Adaize's face before she had fully absorbed what had just been handed to her. Folake stood, walked to her room and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long while before the tears came, because grief, like everything else in her, preferred to arrange itself carefully before it showed itself to the room. Tunde Bakari arrived for the formal introduction on a borrowed motorcycle with an oil stain on his trousers he'd clearly tried and mostly failed to scrub out beforehand. His good shirt was clean and carefully ironed, and he had the particular stiffness of a man who knows he's being measured and isn't entirely sure against which scale. Folake noticed that he greeted every single person in the room, including the neighbor's children who'd wandered in to watch, before he sat down. She noticed that when her mother offered him tea, he thanked her twice, once when it arrived and once when he finished it. She noticed that when he spoke to her, he looked at her the way you look at a set of accounts you're trying to genuinely understand, not the way men sometimes look at women while performing confidence for an audience. She asked him the question she had promised herself she would ask whoever her father chose. Are you a good man? He considered it honestly, which she appreciated more than any quick yes could have earned her. I try to be, most days. Some days I fail at it, but I try consistently, and I think that's the truest answer I have. She nodded slowly. What matters most to you, she asked, in a person you'd spend your life beside? Honesty, she said, and the willingness to stay in a room once it turns difficult. He looked at her for a moment. My father used to say almost exactly that. Different words, same shape. They sat together in a silence that didn't need filling. Folake did not feel what her sister had described feeling the moment she first saw 3 warehouses in a row. She didn't feel the quick thrill of an obvious future or the easy certainty that came from visible success. What she felt was quieter, less cinematic, and far more durable. The sense of sitting across from someone who was exactly what he presented himself as. No more performance underneath, no hidden discount to discover later. For a woman who had learned to read people slowly and carefully, the way her father had taught her to read a column of figures, that was not a small thing. It was in fact nearly everything. Adese's wedding filled the largest hall the town had to offer. Twice over if you counted the overflow tent erected in the churchyard next door. Segun spared nothing. 3 changes of matching asoebi, a live band flown in from the capital, a cake stacked high enough that the top tier required a small ladder to properly cut. Adese moved through the celebration the way sunlight moves through a room with all the curtains thrown open, completely and without apology, delighted with exactly what she'd asked for and finding it precisely as satisfying as imagined. She didn't seek Folake out specifically that evening, but their eyes met once across the crowded hall, and Adese offered her sister a smile that was genuinely warm and carried within its warmth, almost invisibly, the small, private satisfaction of someone who has gotten exactly what she wanted. Folake smiled back, and it wasn't performance. Her love for her sister was real, and real love doesn't dissolve simply because it's been taken advantage of once. It just learns to carry the grief of that alongside itself, the way a river carries silt without stopping being a river. Tunde, standing beside her, leaned in quietly. "Are you all right?" she said. He didn't press further, didn't fill the space with reassurance she hadn't asked for. He simply stayed beside her, which she was slowly learning was precisely what he did in every moment that called for presence rather than performance. Their own wedding, weeks later, was small. A church service, a hall reception with jollof rice her mother insisted on cooking herself because she wanted her elder daughter to have something made by hand rather than arranged by a caterer. The dress was simple in the particular way of things chosen with care rather than expense. Tunde arrived on the same borrowed motorcycle, now returned to its owner, having walked the last half mile instead in his good shoes rather than risk the oil stain again. His best man was his workshop apprentice. His suit had clearly been rented, and his eyes, when Folake walked toward him, held the specific disbelief of a man who cannot quite trust the quality of what is approaching him. Nobody in that hall laughed at him, but if they had, Folake wouldn't have noticed because she was watching his face, and his face was already telling her everything that mattered. Quick pause. If you've ever chosen the steady thing over the impressive thing and wondered if you'd regret it, drop steady in the comments. We're only halfway through what that choice actually cost and earned for Folake. Keep going. The early seasons of their marriage did not spare them anything, and Folake would never want the record softened because a comfortable version of a true story is worth less than the true story itself. Tunde's workshop carried all the fragility of a small business still finding its feet. One broken piece of equipment could undo 2 months of progress. There were nights they sat at their own uneven-legged table, a wedding gift from her mother, matching the one from her childhood almost too neatly, working through numbers with total concentration. Folake never complained, not because she'd swallowed her frustration into a performance of contentment, but because she'd made a genuine decision somewhere in the weeks after her father's death that a marriage should be measured not by its present conditions, but by the direction those conditions were traveling. She could see the direction clearly enough. It was slow, but it was up. Tunde worked with the specific consistency she recognized from her father's own habits. Up before 5 most mornings, honest with suppliers even when honesty cost him a faster profit, building the kind of reputation that pays out patiently rather than quickly. He made decisions carefully and then executed them without hesitation, which she came to understand was the discipline of someone who'd learned never to confuse the speed of a decision with its soundness. At home, he remained exactly the man he'd been on the day they met. He stayed in the room when the room turned difficult. He asked how she was and genuinely wanted the real answer, not the polite one. He noticed when she was carrying something heavy before she'd worked up the nerve to mention it. He loved her the way a well-built wall holds a house up, invisibly, without ceremony, simply doing the load-bearing work nobody thinks to thank a wall for. In the 4th year of their marriage, the state government announced a rural electrification project requiring generator and equipment contractors across the region for installation and long-term maintenance. Tunde wasn't the biggest name being considered, by his own estimate, perhaps 5th or 6th on anyone's shortlist. But when the project coordinator came through town interviewing local technicians, 3 separate clients mentioned his name unprompted before she'd finished asking the question. He was awarded the smallest lot available, covering 2 districts. He treated them like they were the whole project, showing up early, fixing things correctly the first time, answering calls at hours that weren't technically his obligation. When the lead contractor came back at the end of the pilot phase and quietly offered him the 2 difficult districts nobody else wanted, Tunde simply nodded and said he would handle them properly. He did. By the project's 3rd phase, his small workshop had become the primary maintenance contractor for the entire regional rollout. The capital let him expand into an actual facility, hire trained technicians, and buy the service vans that had been the one piece standing between his operation and real growth. The business grew the way things grow when the roots are sound, not in one dramatic leap, but in a steady widening that is, because it always is, the natural outcome of years of honest work. The day the new facility opened, Folake stood in the entrance and went quiet for a moment. Tunde came to stand beside her. "You built this," she said. "We built this," he corrected. She started to argue the business had always technically been his, but he stopped her before she could. "You stayed through the years it wasn't yet anything. You never once made me feel small for what it wasn't yet becoming. A person who can do that is not standing beside the foundation, she is part of it." Folake looked at him and felt something she had no precise word for. The specific feeling of someone who had once given something away, believing it was purely a loss, only to discover much later and in a shape she could never have predicted that what she had surrendered had somehow found its way back to her heavier and richer than it had left. Funke visited on a Tuesday in the 7th year of Folake and Tunde's marriage. She sat in their living room, comfortable now, not showy, but genuinely warm in the way a space becomes once it's been lived in rather than merely furnished, and told Folake in the careful voice of someone unsure whether the news would land as relief or grief that things had gone badly for Adese. Folake already knew some of it. Relatives had a way of delivering information she hadn't asked for. She knew that the haulage business had been struggling for 2 years, some tangled combination of overextension and the particular arrogance of a man who'd confused rapid growth with sound judgment. What she didn't know was the specific detail her mother delivered now. The bank took the warehouses in September, all 3. Segun had borrowed against them to cover losses on a contract that fell through. They are renting a small flat behind his brother's shop now. Folake sat with that for a moment. She thought about the wedding hall, the Asoebi changes, the smile across the crowd that had carried its small private satisfaction. She did not feel what people might expect, not vindication. She felt grief, the specific kind that comes from watching someone you love land somewhere they might have avoided, and understanding the grief belongs partly to them and partly to the younger version of both of you who existed before any of it happened. She called her sister that evening. Adese answered on the 5th ring in the voice of someone working hard to sound like she wasn't in the condition she actually was. "I've heard," Folake said. Silence. Then, "I'm not calling to say anything about it. I'm calling because you're my sister." When Adese's voice returned, the careful performance had cracked open into something rawer than anything Folake had heard from her in years. "I made a mistake," Adese said. "Not just the money, everything. I saw what you had and told myself I was choosing the bigger life. I thought you were the one settling." A longer pause. "I was wrong about which of us was settling." Folake chose the truest thing she had. You loved him. Even if it started with what he had, what came after was real. That still counts. Does it matter now? It matters for what comes next. It always matters that something was real. They talked for almost 2 hours, the longest conversation they'd shared since their father's funeral, and the most honest one they'd ever had in their entire lives together. When the call ended, Tunde sat beside her and listened as she relayed what her mother and sister had told her without once interrupting, which was simply what he did. Then he asked, "What do you need right now?" She thought about it. "I need to know this," she gestured, meaning the house, the facility, the life. "Was never really about this." "What does that mean to you?" "I need to know that if all of it disappeared tomorrow, we'd still be two people sitting in a room talking to each other." He took the question seriously, the way he took everything. "Yes," he said finally. "I loved you before I had a single thing worth losing. That part of it never changed, and it isn't going to." Folake held that sentence the way you hold something you intend to keep. "Good," she said. "That's enough." They had 2 children over the following years, a son with his father's habit of watching a room before speaking in it, and a daughter who laughed loudly and often, which her parents considered a particular kind of blessing. Tunde's business kept widening steadily, the only kind of growth that never demands you spend energy managing the mess its own speed leaves behind. In the 10th year of their marriage, the Regional Trade Board recognized his company for integrity in contract fulfillment. Not size, not volume, but the manner in which the work had been done. He accepted the award quietly and put the plaque on a shelf in his workshop office rather than the reception area someone suggested, because he said the men who'd actually earned it with him would see it there more often than any visitor would. He told Folake that evening. She read the plaque twice. "Your father would have liked this one," she said. "Yours too," he said. They sat together in the kind of silence that didn't need to prove anything to anyone. In the garden of a comfortable but unshowy house, years later, Folake sometimes sat in the late afternoon and thought about her father, the rain on the tin roof, the smell of wet earth through an open window, the sentence, "There are 2 men whose fathers I have spoken with," that had quietly rearranged the shape of her life before she understood what shape it was taking. She thought about Tunde arriving on a borrowed motorcycle with an oil stain he couldn't quite scrub clean, and the disbelief in his eyes on their wedding day. She thought about Adeze rebuilding slowly now, an honest process with no shortcuts, because whatever had been built the first time had stood on ground that was never solid enough to hold it. Folake helped where she could, quietly, expecting nothing back, the only kind of helping she'd ever known how to do. She thought too about what might have happened had she refused that Tuesday. She understood with the clarity of someone who knew a man deeply that Tunde would have been exactly who he was regardless of who sat beside him. His steadiness had never depended on her presence. But she would never have recognized what that steadiness meant if she hadn't been the one sitting beside it through every difficult year. That understanding was something she could not have inherited or purchased. It had to be earned through the very sacrifice that once looked from the outside like losing. The grief was real, the sacrifice was real, and every part of it had turned out to be necessary. Not because hardship is required for a good life, but because the road she had traveled had built inside her an understanding no shortcut could have produced. That what a person has is rarely a reliable measure of what they are. That the quiet, steady love of someone who simply stays outweighs the loud, dazzling arrival of someone who merely impresses. Her father had understood this decades before she did. 36 years teaching people to balance a ledger taught her that the correct answer rarely announces itself as the most attractive one. He handed her the hardest problem of her adult life, and she solved it, one honest entry at a time. And the solution had become the very life she now sat inside, watching her children chase each other around the garden while her husband's van turned into the gate. He climbed out looking tired, the way honest labor tires a person, completely, without apology. He saw her on the porch and raised her hand. She raised hers back. That was the whole of it. A man returning home, a woman waiting for him, two hands lifted in fading light, and under that small, ordinary gesture, more than a decade of quietly accumulated understanding that this exact moment was precisely the future her father glimpsed the day he looked at a young man with an oil-stained shirt and a borrowed motorcycle and decided, without needing to explain himself further, that this was the right direction for the daughter he trusted to carry the family's weight without dropping it. She had carried it, and somewhere along the way, without her quite noticing when, it had stopped being a weight at all. Envy rarely introduces itself honestly. It doesn't arrive wearing its own name. It borrows the face of ambition, of fairness, of "this should have been mine," convincing enough that people have dismantled entire families, broken promises they once meant to keep, and called the wreckage a correction. What envy never mentions is that the life you are so desperate to claim was shaped patiently by the person already living inside it, and that what you actually want is not the life itself, but an imagined version of yourself wearing it, a version that doesn't exist and never will, regardless of which warehouse you owned or which name you took. Adeze wanted Segun's visible success. She got it, and for a while it was real. And then the ground beneath it gave way, the way ground built too quickly under too much weight tends to. Folake wanted only to keep her father's peace and her family whole. What she received instead was an education money could never have purchased, discovering one honest year after another that the thing nobody looked at twice was in fact the only thing in the room worth keeping. That is the entire lesson, and it doesn't need dressing up to be true. Watch closely for the people in your life who arrive without noise, who work without needing applause for the working, who stay without requiring a reward for the staying, who choose to love you on the exact days loving you costs them something, not merely on the easy days when it confirms what they already believed about you. Those are the people your father or whoever first taught you how to balance a ledger of your own would have wanted you to choose. They are the people worth choosing anyway, even when no one is asking you to. If any part of Folake's story landed somewhere true for you, send it to one person before you close this. Someone you know needs the reminder that the quiet choice, the humble beginning, and the person who simply keeps showing up are not the smaller prize. They are usually the only real one. Drop a comment telling me which moment stayed with you longest. Follow for more stories exactly like this one, and I'll see you in the next one.